What would you do if the government forced you to abandon your beliefs, to dress differently, to give up your own culture? For centuries, the Guna lived with relative autonomy on the islands of the Panamanian Caribbean until the state decided to impose its authority and completely change their way of life. I'm Fish, and today we're going to look at when the Guna people stood up against the state of Panama. This is the story of the Tule Revolution. Panama hasn't always been a country that respected indigenous peoples. In fact, during the early years of the Republic, the Panamanian state pushed policies that sought to integrate indigenous communities into the new nation, often without considering their identities, cultures, and forms of organization. To understand the Guna Revolution of 1925, we have to go back to an uncomfortable moment in our history, the first years after the separation from Colombia. After separating from Colombia in 1903, the country was born as a young republic, politically fragile and deeply concerned with projecting an image of order, progress, and modernity. For the ruling elites of the time, that modernity was associated with European and Western models and often involved relegating or trying to transform everything that didn't fit that vision, including indigenous culture. And it's in this context that the Guna people enter into direct conflict with the Panamanian state. The Guna, also known as Tule, had inhabited the San Blas Islands and the Caribbean coast of the Isthmus for centuries. They had their own political system, general congresses, traditional leaders known as saglas, their spirituality, their language, and a deep, structured, and living culture. During the Columbian period, the state's presence in their territory was limited, which allowed the Guna to preserve much of their autonomy and traditional forms of organization. But with the birth of the new Republic of Panama, that relationship began to change. The Panamanian government pushed the idea that they should be integrated into the new nation. But in practice, that integration really meant forced assimilation. Attempts were made to eliminate their traditional clothing. Their rituals and spiritual practices were suppressed. Their traditional authorities and forms of self-government were delegitimized. Guna women, for example, were forced by the police to strip off their traditional attire. Molas, those colorful embroidered blouses that today are a symbol of Panama's culture, were taken away because they were considered backward or characteristic of people who, according to that vision, were not civilized. They were also stripped of their gold nose rings, known as olasu, and in many cases, their weenies were cut off, that is, the beads they wore on their arms and legs. These actions had a very clear objective: to force them to abandon their identity and adopt Western clothing and cultural patterns. Traditional leaders were stripped of their authority. Community congresses were monitored and, in some cases, suppressed. And the presence of armed police who did not speak their language or recognize their forms of government was imposed on the communities. For many Guna, that felt like a colonial regime operating within the Republic of Panama itself. And little by little, the tension grew. The Guna were not a people known for violence, but they were a people deeply proud of their identity. And when the police began to raid the communities, entering homes at night, using violence, humiliating, and making arbitrary arrests, the indignation began to transform into something more dangerous. The breaking point came in 1921 in a community called Rio Azucar. The police entered looking for a Guna woman who had refused to abandon her traditional clothing. As a pressure tactic, members of her family were detained. When the community tried to prevent it, a confrontation occurred. In that episode, 3 Gunas died, as well as indigenous police officers who collaborated with the state authority. The bodies were left exposed on the beaches as a warning. For many Guna, it became very clear that the conflict with the state of Panama no longer represented a simple political or administrative problem, but a direct threat to their existence as a people. From that moment on, the silent organization began for something the Guna had never attempted before: an armed rebellion. The leaders became the axis of that process. One of them was Iguay Beligna, better known as Nelly Cantule, Sila of Ustapu. a respected figure, strategist, and deeply committed to the defense of his people's identity. And the other was Olajindibabine, also known as Simril Coleman, Sila of Aligandi, with an even firmer stance toward the Panamanian state. Both shared a clear conviction. If they didn't act, the Guna people ran the risk of disappearing as a cultural entity. It was in that context that in February 1925, they called a Guna General Congress, in which other fundamental indigenous leaders also participated. For several weeks, Guna representatives from various communities met in secret. This was no ordinary meeting. It was, in practice, an indigenous parliament with a very clear objective. There, a historic decision was made. The Guna were not going to limit themselves to asking for reforms or concessions. They decided to separate from the Panamanian state. Thus, the Republic of Tule was proclaimed, an independent indigenous state with its own flag and with a form of government based on its traditional authorities. The flag was designed by Maria Coleman, granddaughter of Simril Coleman. It had a yellow background with red stripes and a black symbol in the center, an ancestral swastika used long before in different indigenous cultures as a spiritual sign. For the Guna people, this symbol represented concepts linked to creation, life, and the order of the world, with no relation to the meaning it would have decades later in Europe. That flag flew for the first time as the emblem of the Republic of Tule, becoming a direct symbol of the Guna Revolution. Over time, the Guna people also adopted another flag, known as Guna Swenamore, associated with the territory and identity of the Guna Yala region. Today, when visiting their villages, it's very common to see both flags flying together. Both are widely accepted by their community as legitimate representations of their history, their territory, and their identity as a people. Before we continue, I want you to know that if you're interested in visiting the beautiful San Blas Islands or any other site in Panama, I recommend using Tuluna's Travel and Living. They're a travel agency that will organize everything you need for your journey. Sometimes planning a trip can be a real headache, so just let them take care of everything for you. I'll be leaving their contact info here and down in the description. And don't forget to tell them that Fish sent ya. Now then, let's get back to the story. Returning to the revolution, declaring a republic was one thing, but defending it was something very different. And the Guna knew it. Taking advantage of the carnival days of 1925. Pass me a beer, friend. While the government's attention was focused on other regions of the country, the Gunas set their plan in motion. Groups of armed men set out in canoes from various islands. The attacks occurred almost simultaneously against Panamanian police posts in places like Nargana, Rio Tigre, Tiquintiki, and other points in the archipelago. It was a swift, coordinated, and decisive action. During the clashes, several members of the Panamanian police died at the hands of the revolution. Historical estimates speak of around 25 deaths as a result of the uprisings. In a matter of days, Panamanian authority was expelled from the entire San Blas archipelago. The Republic of Tule became a reality, but Panama was not going to accept it so easily. President Rodolfo Chiari asked the United States for help, not to negotiate with the Guna, but to crush them. Washington sent the war cruiser USS Cleveland to the region, a U.S. Navy ship clearly superior to any force present in San Blas. Panamanian agents also traveled on it, intending to reclaim the territory. The scene was profoundly unequal. On one side, indigenous communities armed mostly with shotguns and machetes, and on the other, a world power with naval cannons. But then, something unexpected happened. U.S. diplomat John G. South met with Guna leaders and heard their testimonies firsthand. He heard accounts of abuse, cultural impositions, and violence carried out by the authorities. From then on, it became very clear to the U.S. representation that it wasn't just a criminal act, but one strictly tied to the survival of the Guna people. The United States chose not to support direct military action. I'm not getting involved here, my friend, against the Guna communities. Instead, it pushed for a negotiated solution to the conflict. On March 4th, 1925, aboard the USS Cleveland, an agreement was signed that would end the armed confrontation. The Guna agreed to rejoin the sovereignty of Panama, but in exchange, the Panamanian state had to accept something that would mark a turning point in Panama's politics: the recognition of indigenous autonomy. The government committed to respecting Guna culture and not imposing schools or police forces without the community's consent. It also allowed the Guna people to govern themselves according to their own authorities and traditional norms. In this way, the Republic of Tule ceased to exist, and the path began to be paved that would give rise to what is now the Yala region, the first indigenous autonomy to be legally recognized in Panama. In 1942, the Guna people decided to modify the original flag of the Tule Revolution because the central symbol began to be associated internationally with a certain German regime. To differentiate it from that use, foreign to their culture, a red circle was added around the swastika as a representation of the Alasu. Years later, in 2010, the use of the flag known as Gunasu in Amor was consolidated. However, both flags continue to be widely accepted within the community as legitimate symbols of their history and their collective identity. Today, Guna children learn these stories in their own classrooms. However, outside the region, the Tule Revolution, also known as the Tule Revolution, remains an episode that is rarely addressed in the Panamanian educational system. The word Tule means person in the Guna language, and the Tule Revolution was, in essence, a total victory for the indigenous people of Panama. It was a revolution of people, and for the people, with an identity and a culture that simply refused to disappear. Your turn. Why do you think this story isn't told much in Panama's classrooms, despite its importance? Do you think that today, Panama already fully respects the Guna's autonomy? Or is there room for improvement? Leave me your answer down here in the comments section.